Hello and welcome to today's lesson, which is on What Were They Like by Denise Levertov. First thing we're going to do is we're going to find out some information about the poet as well as the Vietnam War, which inspired the poem. Okay, so a little bit of information about Denise Levertov. So she was born in 1923 in Essex, but actually moved to the USA. So in the 1960s, she felt incredibly angry at the Vietnam War, and she felt so angry at the Vietnam War, she felt compelled to organise protests. She also wrote poetry, protest poetry, such as What Were They Like, to air her views on the subject. So I've mentioned there the Vietnam War. We're now going to look in some detail about what the Vietnam War was. So the Vietnam War, very long war, lasted 20 years, started in 1955 and actually went on until 1975. And it was fought between North and South Vietnam originally. North Vietnam were communist and South Vietnam were generally more of a Western style government considered to be in the mold of Western capitalism. So America got involved in this conflict because they desperately hated communism and they wanted to do whatever they could to crush the spread of communism throughout the world. So they saw if communism was sprouting up in a different country, they viewed it as their duty to stop communism. So they got involved against North Vietnam, who were communist, and they supported South Vietnam. So throughout the war, America was accused of war crimes against the Vietnamese, such as the bombing and murder of Vietnamese civilians, rather than just the Vietnamese soldiers. They were accused of going after the Vietnamese civilians. So here's some pictures from the Vietnam War. As you can see, some American soldiers, and very famously, this war had lots of pictures associated with it. In fact, it was one of the first wars where people got colour photos of what was actually going on, and people were reading the newspapers back home in America, and they could really see what was happening and what their troops were getting up to in some detail. And as I said, the first war to use colour photos that was reported in colour photos. So this was one particularly horrific incident, which was known as the My Lai massacre. So over 500 innocent civilians were shot dead by American soldiers, and there are also allegations of gang rape and mutilation. So a really, really horrendous incident in history, and this is a picture from the aftermath of the My Lai massacre. So another shameful incident in the history of the conflict was the use of Agent Orange, which I'll come back to when we analyse the poem in detail. So what was Agent Orange? Well, it was something that was sprayed to deprive the North Vietnamese of food. So the US sprayed crops with Agent Orange, and you can see here this helicopter, and the white spray is this Agent Orange that is being sprayed on the crops. So the Vietnamese government estimated that 3 million people suffered illness as a result of the use of Agent Orange. 3 million. So there was reports of cancer in some cases. Okay, so as I said, it was one of the first wars where the public got to see detailed photos of what was going on in colour and, of course, in black and white as well. And the US public, seeing all of these pictures, heavily protested the war. And here are some real pictures of protesters. So it's saying, end the war in Vietnam and resist the draft, don't register. So the draft is where soldiers could be called up, or anyone could be, any able-bodied man could be called up to fight in the Vietnam War. But the protesters were saying, right, if you are selected for the draft to fight in the Vietnam War, don't get involved, resist the draft. Okay, so US troops actually pulled out in 1972, and the conflict as a whole was finished by 1975. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read through the poem. And as you can see, it's written in a series of questions and answers, and we're going to read the questions and then read the answers. And that's obviously one way of reading the poem. Number 1. Did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? 2. Did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? 3. Were they inclined to quiet laughter? 4. Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? 5. Had they an epic poem? 6. Did they distinguish between speech and singing? 1. Sir, their light's heart turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens, stone gardens, illumined pleasant ways. 2. Perhaps they gathered once to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. 4. A dream ago, perhaps, ornament is for joy, all the bones were charred. 5. It is not remembered. Remembered most were peasants. Their life was in rice and bamboo, when peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies, and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces. Maybe fathers told their sons old tales when bombs smashed those mirrors, where there was time only to scream. 6. There is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. It was reported their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. Who can say now? It is silent now. Okay, so as you can see, this poem is separated into 2 blocks of text. The first block of text or stanza is 6 questions, and then those 6 questions are answered in the second block of text. The first question then, did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? So what is the significance of this? Well, more will be explained obviously with the answer, but stone is suggesting some form of permanence. So despite everything that the Vietnamese have gone through, there is permanence to their lives. And actually, despite the horrific bombing campaign, the use of Agent Orange, they will carry on. Their lives will carry on. Okay, number 2, did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? So reverence is that really respectful, almost worship. And it says, did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? Obviously, that bud of a flower, and a bud would normally represent new life. So the question is saying, did they celebrate new life? And again, this can be much better analysed when we look at the answer. Number 3, were they inclined to quiet laughter? So perhaps the idea of quiet laughter represents the Vietnamese culture of almost quiet respect, and although they might celebrate or they may show joy, everything will be done in a restrained manner, reflecting the gentle Vietnamese culture. So number 4, did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? So not only are these significant because they're often used in spiritual ceremonies, and some of these are very expensive materials, but they again link to that idea of permanence. You can go to museums and see jade ornaments that are centuries and centuries old, and they're still perfectly preserved. So it represents the permanence of Vietnamese culture. Whatever they go through, they will still carry on in some form. So had they an epic poem? So an epic poem is usually a poem, obviously a long extended poem, but it's a poem that features a hero as its main character. So perhaps this is a celebration of Vietnamese culture and the fact that actually, although they suffered a great deal, the North Vietnamese were ultimately victorious against the Vietnamese troops. It suggests that although they may not have the supplies and equipment of the Americans, actually, as a hardened and resilient. So number 6, did they distinguish between speech and singing? So the idea being that if they didn't distinguish between speech and singing, they were obviously a very happy people. So these questions will really have a lot more significance when we find out the answers, which we're going to do next. The answer to number 1, and if we go back, we might go sort of back and forth a little bit here. Number 1 says, did the people of Vietnam use lanterns and stones? Lanterns of stone rather, third time lucky. Let's have a look at the answer. Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens, stone gardens illumined pleasant ways. So let's start off with this word sir. So why does the answer start with the reference to sir? So perhaps it really suggests here the sombre importance of what is being spoken about. Sir is a respectful term and really indicates that what the poet is about to say is very important, hence the solemn and serious tone created by sir. Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. So initially, they had very happy hearts, light-hearted, they were joyful, but it was turned to stone. The conflict that the Americans really the Americans engaged in turned their light hearts to stone. And it says it is not remembered whether in gardens, stone gardens, illumine pleasant ways. So initially, the stone gardens were a big part of Vietnamese culture and a pleasant part of the culture, very aesthetically pretty, would be used in various Vietnamese ceremonies. However, after the war, it's not remembered whether they were used anymore. Perhaps pleasant ways, it's being suggested, were a thing of the past. After the Vietnamese villages were bombed, civilians died. Perhaps this led to the end of certain pleasant ways. Number 2, perhaps they gathered once to delight in blossom. So if we go back to number 2 quickly, did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? Do they still celebrate the new life, blossoming of flowers? And the poet says, they gathered once to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. This is fairly self-explanatory, but it says, well, it's very hard to celebrate new life when their children are being killed. And actually, this is not ambiguous. This is not wrapped up in poetic metaphors. It puts quite simply here, their children were killed. And there's a real stark simplicity to that. Children were killed. This is a conflict that didn't just affect Vietnamese soldiers against American soldiers. Innocent civilians were died. So they weren't going to necessarily just have the same ceremony celebrating new life because they were so affected by the conflict. Okay, number 3, the question was, were they inclined to quiet laughter? And the answer, sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. Now, burned mouth is specifically a reference to Agent Orange. So this was Agent Orange was sprayed over crops, particularly in North Vietnam, and the impact of Agent Orange was that millions of Vietnamese, their health was affected. So laughter is bitter to the burned mouth, the lasting impacts of Agent Orange. So number 4, and let's just go back and look at the question. So did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? And the poem replies and says, a dream ago, perhaps. So they used to use jade and silver and ivory. Ornament is for joy, all the bones are charred. So really the answer is, well, not really, because ornament is something you would use for joy. And considering that hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese men, innocent men, women, and children were killed in the conflict, and their bones were charred due to the bombs. They weren't using joyful ornaments anymore. That was a thing of the past, thanks to the Americans. So again, this is a real attack on the war in Vietnam, saying that actually, by engaging in this war in Vietnam, you have killed innocent Vietnamese. So number 5, and the question for number 5 was, had they an epic poem? And remember I said that an epic poem is a long poem that features a hero at its centre as its protagonist. So number 5 is not remembered. Remember, most peasants, their life was in rice and bamboo. So it's saying epic poems. Often Westerners are remembered through glamorous Hollywood films, but these are just peasants and their life was in rice and bamboo. So unlike the Western privileged Westerners, they didn't get the luxury of being remembered in an epic poem, because actually they were very modest, very humble peasants. So it's not remembered. These next 3 lines I'm about to read through really creates a sense of how peaceful and joyful life was in Vietnam before the Americans invaded. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces. So again, it's very calm, very tranquil, very relaxed. This is the life in Vietnam before the conflict. And it goes on to say, so remember, this question was about, were they remembered in an epic poem? And the poet says, maybe fathers told their sons old tales. When bombs smashed those mirrors, there was only time to scream. So, and actually, rather than epic poems, really the only way this bloody conflict is being remembered is stories that their fathers would tell their eventual children. Stories of bombs smashing mirrors, only time to scream. So again, she's not mincing her words here, Denise Levertov. She's clearly saying this is a horrific war that killed thousands. Okay, so answer 6. Let's go back to question 6. Did they distinguish between speech and singing? So remember, this question really is about, are they still joyful? Because if you're not distinguishing singing and talking, you are just going along very happily, singing and laughing and being very joyful. So number 6, there is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. So it's saying, well, not really. They're no longer singing. There's a vague echo of a song. So there's an echo of happiness. But it's not completely the same. The Vietnam War has changed so much. It will never be the same. And if we go on, it was reported their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. So what is the significance of moths? Their singing resembled moths in moonlight. So one thing is that actually moths are attracted to light, but obviously once they go up to the light, they get burned. So this represents again what happened to the Vietnamese. They were really burnt. They were really hurt by the conflict when the Americans invaded. And this line is just so powerful. Who can say it is silent now? So this leaves so much room for interpretation, and it doesn't need to illustrate here and spell out that thousands and thousands and thousands of Vietnamese men, women, and children died. It is silence now, and that silence is used to reflect the sheer tragedy of the situation. Okay, what we're going to have a look at is the form, which remember is the shape, size, and indeed the number of the stanzas. So the poem has a very distinctive form. I can't remember seeing a poem written in this question and answer style. It is comprised of 2 blocks of 3 verse. The first block contains 6 questions and the second block contains 6 answers. So it can be read in 2 blocks. You can read, as I did, the questions, then the answers. Or if you wanted to, you could read a question, read an answer, read a question, read an answer, and go back and forth. So it's almost that freedom kind of links in with Denise Levertov as being, a free-flowing war poet. The structure, which remember generally refers to the meter and the rhyme scheme, is written in free verse, meaning that there is no distinct rhyme scheme. So the free-flowing rhyme scheme was popular among anti-war activists. So remember, these anti-war activists were considered very left-wing, quite fashionable, almost often associated with the hippie movement. So they would not want to be, if they were kind of hippies, fashionable, they wouldn't want to be seen to be constrained by archaic, old-fashioned, strict rhyme schemes and poetic forms. There is also no distinct meter to the poem. Again, this links with that everything's free flowing exchange of ideas amongst these slightly hippie anti-war activists. Okay, hopefully you found that helpful. If you would like to look at other poems I've analysed in the Edexcel conflict series, please check out the rest of my YouTube channel. As ever, thanks for listening.